Hi, this is John Linneball from John Linneball Tutoring, and this is AP US History Video 23, Democratic and Republican Government. Don't forget to comment, like, share, and subscribe if you like this video, and if you don't like ads, you could try subscribing to my locals.com site, which is testpreparation.locals.com. The ideals of the American Revolution, Anglicanism and Enlightenment ideas, and their relationship to British rule. Because of evangelical Protestantism, British colonists saw themselves as a chosen people who were blessed with liberty and meant to be an example to the world. You can see Winthrop's City on a Hill sermon from 1630, which is in video 7, and Danforth's Errand in the Wilderness sermon from 1672. In the 1700s, however, evangelical Protestantism got its start, focusing on individual conversion rather than established churches. Evangelical Protestantism and the American Revolution. Ministers used language of republicanism. So from the Great Awakening to the Revival movement, preachers used the language that complemented the idea of small r republicanism. That is not today's Republican Party, because that didn't exist yet, but the idea that the colonies should form a republic. The ministers portrayed the French and Indian War as a war against Catholicism, and they later likened Great Britain to the devil and urged congregations to avoid corruption, that is, British rule. John Allen gave the sermon Oration on the Beauties of Liberty, 1772, where he denounced British threats to prosecute those who were involved in the Gaspee or Gaspé affair, depending on how you want to pronounce it, and that we've covered in video 22, then condemned British threats in general. The sermon was reproduced in print and distributed through 7 printings in 4 cities. The Age of Revolutions and Enlightenment Thought. Historians still debate the degree to which the American Revolution was motivated by ideology versus the daily experience of living under oppressive British policies. Enlightenment ideas did give colonists the lens through which to view British policies, or at least the lens through which they did view British policies. Other revolutions, such as France, Haiti, and a number of Spanish Latin American colonies, followed the American Revolution based on the same ideas, Enlightenment ideas about reason, individual liberty, and governments. French philosopher Montesquieu, in The Spirit of the Laws, published in 1748, suggested a balance of government powers, criticized the British government, and was later used in the US Constitution. So, let's move on. John Locke's ideas. Arguably the most important Enlightenment thinker, he wrote 2 treatises on government to justify the Glorious Revolution in 1688. In the second treatise on government, 1689, Locke wrote that legitimate government power arises from the consent of the governed, and that government exists to protect the basic rights of life, liberty, and property. Revolution is justified if the government doesn't protect these rights. He also opposed Thomas Hobbes' idea of an absolutist monarchy and Sir Robert Filmer's divine right of kings idea, because those are both extremely anti-democratic, and basically said, well, Hobbes' idea was Leviathan, you need something that's going to scare everybody into behaving right, and divine right of kings said, well, the king just has this right that comes from God to be the king and rule everybody, and he's responsible only to God, so definitely not very democratic and has nothing to do with the idea of a social contract. So John Locke challenged the traditional form of government, was against monarchy and divine right, and proposed there was a social contract, that people don't have to obey a government that doesn't help them out and take care of them. Republican democracy, Paine's common sense, and the idea of the Declaration of Independence. Academic debates about the ideal form of government became more intense as the struggle over imperial rule raged on. Enlightenment ideas influenced the writings of Thomas Paine, most famously Common Sense, and of course the Declaration of Independence. The American philosophers, academics, and revolutionaries all used Enlightenment ideas based on the idea of natural rights, that is, life, liberty, and property, as Locke put it, and the self-governing republic. Split loyalties. In 1776, independence was not a certainty. It actually seemed likely that the British would crush the uprising, which would then be remembered as a treasonous plot, and more likely than not, we'd all be British rather than U.S. citizens. Roughly a third of the colonists were, in quotes, patriots who wanted independence, that is, the revolutionaries, and another third were loyalists or Tories who wanted the colonies to remain part of Britain, and a third did not ally themselves with a side. Reminds me of that song from the 1980s, Mike and the Mechanics. Silent running, swear allegiance to the flag, whatever flag they offer, never hint at how you really feel. Okay, that song was actually not the branch petition. The Continental Congress, or CC as I'll put it here, in an attempt at reconciliation, sent a petition to George III in July 1775, and in the petition the Congress reaffirmed its loyalty to George III and blamed the political crisis on Parliament. John Dickinson of Pennsylvania was its main author, but Ben Franklin, John Jay, and John Rutledge were also on the drafting committee. The petition called for more equitable trade and the repeal of the Intolerable Acts. Unfortunately, a letter from John Adams, another member of the Continental Congress, or the CC, to James Warren was intercepted by the British, and that letter expressed Adams's opinion that the Olive Branch Petition was futile and war was inevitable. So the British would then use this to argue that the Olive Branch Petition was never sincere. So they didn't mean it in the first place. And here are a couple links to what was the Olive Branch Petition and the Wikipedia entry on the Olive Branch Petition, and I'll put that in the links below. King George denied the Olive Branch Petition. Thomas Paine's Common Sense. It's just common sense, people. Anyway, in January 1776, Thomas Paine published a pamphlet called Common Sense, in which he advocated for the colonies to fight for independence. He argued there was not even a single advantage in the American colonies remaining in the British Empire. Oops, there should be a little apostrophe there after colonies, the idea that it's the American colonies' tendency to remain, or the American colonies' decision to remain in the British Empire. Anyway, here's a copy of Common Sense, or the cover sheet to it. And Paine argued forcefully against the Olive Branch Petition, blaming the problems on the king. In any event, the war was already underway. The Declaration of Independence. On July 4th, 1776, a date that we all know, the Second Continental Congress ratified the Declaration of Independence. The preamble paraphrases Locke's statement that all men are created equal and entitled to life, liberty, and property, as life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. It also states that government arises from the consent of the governed, and that when the government fails to do the people's will, it's the right of the people to alter or abolish it. These ideas have shaped democratic movements worldwide, and you still see that today with people forming militias, rising up against the government every so often, etc. as well. If it doesn't represent us, then it doesn't deserve to exist, or people make statements like, the Second Amendment is the reset button on the Constitution, and so on. The body of the document is a list of complaints against King George III, so that's aged less well with time, but it's there. And that was, the lead-in was all the Enlightenment ideas, kind of restated ideas of John Locke, and then the rest was King George did all these bad things, so that's why we're rebelling against Britain. Okay. Ideas of Republicanism. During and after the Revolutionary War, it was unclear what form of government the new United States would choose. The consensus was that the U.S. would be a republic where the rule was by the citizens, not royalty. This was a great departure from the governmental styles of the time. Most countries had monarchs, and the last republic that was worth noting had been Rome, which was about 2,000 years earlier. So the problem with a republic is citizens were unclear on how to behave in a republic. Many believed citizens should live simple, industrious lives and watch for signs of extravagance and corruption in leaders, putting the community's interests before those of individuals. Actually sounds like a pretty good idea to me. This is similar to the Roman Republic and not actually that much different from New England Puritanism, except Puritanism was really not very democratic. And you can see video 6 on Puritanism and video 10 on colonial government for more information. Others believed that Republican citizenship meant freedom to pursue their own interests. Their beliefs were shaped by Adam Smith's laissez-faire economics, the idea that the invisible hand of capitalism would inevitably steer the country in the right direction. But let's take a look at this quote from Adam Smith here. "It is not very unreasonable that the rich should contribute to the public expense not only in proportion to the revenue, but in something more than in that proportion." So definitely still saw the ideas of civic duty and progressive taxation, that the wealthier you are, the higher percentage of your income you should pay to taxes to contribute to the public expense, pay for things like roads and schools and things like that. This was, and still is, the tension between two different competing ideas of what being a good U.S. citizen involves. So what comes first? The civic interest, where everybody should work in the public interest first, or self-interest, should you just do whatever you want and assume things are going to work out? Egalitarianism, the call for equality. While the obvious goal of the American Revolution was to be free, so the colonies would be free from British rule, the new U.S. citizens saw the revolution as a chance to make society more democratic in many ways, such as the abolition of slavery and rights for women, etc. in the United States. The movement to abolish slavery. Colonial leaders were reluctant to apply the talk of liberty and equality to enslaved African Americans, even though the Declaration of Independence itself said, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that men are created equal, all men are created equal," I should say. And slaves in northern states petitioned for freedom as a natural right. In 1779, petitions in New Hampshire and Connecticut for emancipation were denied. 7 free African Americans, including the Cuff brothers, Paul and John, refused to pay taxes in Massachusetts since they couldn't vote. No taxation without representation, right? They just fought a big war over that. And this led to free tax-paying African Americans being granted the right to vote in Massachusetts through a series of rulings and court cases brought by similarly situated free African Americans. The Massachusetts Constitution said all men are born free and equal, so rights granted to some men had to be granted to all in the same class. The movement to abolish slavery continued. Other states gradually abolished slavery. Vermont was an independent republic from 1777 to 1791, and it outlawed slavery in its 1777 Constitution. After 1791, Vermont became the 14th state. Pennsylvania established a system in 1780 of emancipation where any slave born after March 1st, 1780 would be free, but only upon his or her 28th birthday. However, some slaves simply ran away, occasionally with help from sympathetic whites. Evolving ideas on the role of women. The recognition of the contribution of women to the revolutionary cause, from boycotts to battlefield service, helped women be seen as equal to men. And the Remember the Ladies letter. Abigail Adams sent a letter to her husband, John Adams, in March 1776, in which she expressed her wish that John Adams would remember the ladies and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors, and that the new legal system would not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Some historians dismiss this letter as joking between a husband and wife, but most don't, because the letter taken in context with the other writings of Abigail Adams is generally considered to be a serious appeal for women's rights. Especially in the Revolutionary War era, it seems obvious that some would analogize the tyranny of mother country over its colonies to the tyranny of husband over wife. Now let's look at the idea of Republican motherhood. Again, we're not talking about the Republican Party as we understand it. We're talking about the idea of a republic as a democracy where the people are represented and rule the country. So as previously stated, revolutionary ideas led some to question gender roles. The term Republican motherhood wasn't even used before 1976 when it was coined by historian Linda K. Kerber. And you can look up Republican motherhood in Wikipedia, and that's in the links below. The new idea of Republican motherhood, even though it wasn't called that back then, drew on Enlightenment/revolutionary ideas to support the idea that women had civic duties in the new United States. John Locke, in his 2 treatises in government, or on government, I should say, asserted husbands and wives had more equal roles than previously believed, or they should have them anyway. This, combined with the women's battlefield and important support roles off the battlefield, led to support for women's roles in public society, not just the home, even if not in actual government leadership. This should say women's battlefield roles, but anyway, that's okay. The idea of Republican motherhood. Mostly the idea was that women should raise civic-minded sons and reform the morals and manners of men. This was a change because normally men were responsible for their sons' civic education and maintaining public virtue. The Roman Republic had similar ideas and similar familial/societal relations from 600 BC to 500 CE, or AD if you prefer. The idea in both societies was the family is the building block of the state. While Republican motherhood still put women primarily in domestic roles, it did encourage the education of women about civic matters, so they'd be able to educate their sons in such matters. Women's colleges such as Mount Holyoke Female Seminary, which would later become Mount Holyoke College, were established for these purposes, the idea that educated women would be much better at raising civic-minded sons. The effect of the American Revolution in other countries. France, in 1789, roughly 13 years after the Declaration of Independence and 6 years after the Treaty of Paris was signed, a revolution broke out. French revolutionaries were inspired by the same Enlightenment ideas that motivated the American Revolution. The first phase was a revolt of the French national legislature against the monarch, which had widespread U.S. support. The second phase was more radical, and that's where the monarchy was abolished in 1793. The Jacobins took over, killing 40,000 enemies of the revolution, including the king and queen. Remember Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. And then that led to the Reign of Terror, which peaked in 1793 to 1794. Maximilien Robespierre, the Jacobin leader, himself was executed in 1794 in the Thermidorian reaction. Americans were divided over these events, but it's not as though they could really do anything about them. The effect of the American Revolution in other countries continued. 1795, the Directory, a group of 5 men, took over the French government. They themselves were overthrown by Napoleon and his followers in 1799. And Napoleon was a typical, in quotes, democratic dictator. That is, he legitimized his power through a rigged election in 1800, where roughly 3 million people supposedly voted. And hey, the votes were counted by Napoleon's brother, so I'm sure that was a totally fair election and not rigged at all. Yes, I'm being very sarcastic. The real number of voters was probably closer to about 1.5 million. And of course, 99.5% of the people who voted in this election voted for Napoleon, possibly because it wasn't secret, so everybody could see who you were voting for if you voted in that election. A second plebiscite, basically a vote in 1802 with similar results, basically made him dictator for life. So you can see the Napoleon Wikipedia article if you want more information on that. The basic takeaway lesson is that revolutions don't always get you what you want. Don't confuse Napoleon Bonaparte and Napoleon Dynamite. Napoleon Dynamite helped his friend Pedro win a high school student council election in the 2004 film Napoleon Dynamite. However, the results were not rigged, and the events took place in Idaho, not France. Napoleon Dynamite countries. Haiti, 1791. A rebellion took place in this nation on the western side of the island of Hispaniola in Saint-Domingue, the French-controlled part of this nation. Saint-Domingue, I'm sorry if I'm butchering the pronunciation, was primarily a sugar-producing colony. Its population was 60,000 free residents and 500,000 African slaves. About half the free people were mixed race, gens de couleur, I'm sure I'm pronouncing that wrong, and half were white. The mixed-race free people owned approximately 1/3 of the slaves, but were not allowed to vote. The Haitian Revolution took place in 3 stages. First, the white settlers resisted French rule in imitation of the American and French revolutions. Second, the mixed-race planters rebelled against their odd racial/legal status. And third, the slaves rebelled. So definitely the mixed-race planters were not happy that they could own slaves, but weirdly enough weren't allowed to vote. And the slaves, of course, were pretty upset at being slaves, so of course they would revolt. The effect of the American Revolution in other countries. The slaves, led by Toussaint Louverture, and assisted by the Spanish military, occupied a large part of Haiti. The slave rebellion frightened slave-owning planters in the southern U.S. who heard stories from people fleeing Haiti. In 1804, after Louverture's death, Haiti became the first African-American-run country in the New World. The effect of the American Revolution in other countries continued. Latin America, the revolutions here were most like the American U.S. Revolution. Both Latin America and the future United States broke ties with powerful European powers. Both resulted from deep divisions within their societies, and both had rebels and loyalists. Venezuela, Mexico, and Argentina all rebelled against Spanish rule for several financial and political reasons, just as the American British colonies rebelled against British rule for also several financial and political reasons. Did you find this video useful? If you did, please like it and subscribe to my channel. Neither action costs you anything. You'll also be alerted about my new videos. And hey, why not share my videos? Why do I care? It's simple. YouTube doesn't let me share any ad revenue unless I have 1,000 subscribers and 4,000 hours. That's about 240,000 minutes of view time in a year. While many people are watching these, I don't have 4,000 hours of watch time. I also don't have 1,000 subscribers at this time. You want to see this without ads? Try joining my community at testpreparation.locals.com. For the same reasons, you're not only welcome but encouraged to share links to this video, put it in playlists, etc. I'm always happy to read and respond to constructive criticism or suggestions for new videos. I reserve the right to delete comments from and block those who specialize in destructive criticism. You know, trolls, or things that are off topics, and things that are posted by spammers and disturb people. You can hire me for tutoring. I can tutor you in person, subject to COVID requirements, etc. at the time that I'm recording this, or you can always hire me through Zoom, anywhere in the country. I'm in the San Francisco Bay Area if you want to see me in person, and obviously I'm on a computer somewhere on Earth if you want to hire me from anywhere else, and we can do it through Zoom. Thanks for watching, and why not stay tuned for a couple more things I'm going to say here. Here's my contact information. Facebook, you can go to facebook.com/LinnebalTutoring. Instagram, go to instagram.com/john.linnebal.tutoring. Phone is 415-623-4251. It's my cell phone. If you want to text me, that's okay too. And you can email me at john@johnlinnebal.com. My website is johnlinnebal.com or johnlinnebaltutoring.com. They both take you to the same site. And testpreparation.locals.com is my community on locals.com. Well, why not subscribe? And then you can see these things all completely ad-free. And if you want to send good old-fashioned snail mail to me, you can send it to John Linnebal Tutoring, 1859 Powell Street, number 109, San Francisco, California, 94133. All right, this video is based on Barron's AP United States History Review Book, 4th edition, but it is not a substitute for your class's text, etc., because I don't know what materials your AP teacher wants you to know. They might test you on things other than what are in the review book or what I've gone over in Wikipedia, etc. So please do all the reading that your teacher assigns you to do, because otherwise you might not do very well on your teacher's quizzes, tests, etc. I can't be responsible for what your teacher thinks is important and asks about in his or her own tests, homework, etc. So again, please read your teacher's assignments. And with that, I'm out of here. Why don't you have a good day? All right, bye-bye.